The Still Point, Chapter 1, by Prince Demeter. Mulbrain College was a tiny private college nestled between Poughkeepsie, New York, and the Catskills. In the early autumn months, the air was rich with the smell of fall foliage and rain, the lush canopy of thick trees slowly beginning to turn yellow under the fading sun. The campus was green, with wooden lawn chairs scattered carelessly over well-maintained grass and hammocks tacked up between trees. Towering stone buildings stood proud above the students, set with thick stained glass and mossy cobblestone walkways that twisted around the trees, fat with age and sap. The crackle of the record player and the smooth, rich tones of the string quartet emanating from it echoed down the halls of the dormitories, the excited shouts of the first-year boys ringing outside. Next door, someone was speaking loudly, and the bell rang somewhere from another building. George relaxed into his linen sheets, letting the string quartet settle into his bones as he lost himself in the rich sound and the warm music. He knew he had poems to read and books to analyze and journals and periodicals to suffer through before classes started. It wasn't even the first day yet, and he was already busy. Too bad. The assignments would have to wait. He'd missed it here. This summer, he'd stayed in quiet Albany instead of going back to Philadelphia and his family home. His parents had gone on a summer-long vacation instead, taking a boat across the Atlantic to visit his ailing grandmother in London, and Sapnap had been kind enough to offer his family's apartment last minute. George's friend Errett, who lived in New York City, had offered his apartment as well, but Albany was closer to Mulbrain, and George loved coming back to a quiet campus, swinging in one of the hammocks, reading a book in one of the lawn chairs. Albany had been fun too, boating by the docks and visiting the gardens, but Mulbrain had been the first place George had felt welcomed, had felt like himself. He liked coming back. That wasn't to say he hadn't visited Era in New York. Era had been one of his only childhood friends to consistently keep in touch with him, and George would have been a disgraceful friend if he hadn't gone to see him. However much he liked Albany, he liked New York even more. The constant motion of the city, the people, the sights. The air was murky and dingy, the sewers disgusting and smelly, and he'd loved it. Era had taken him to visit the history museums, their loafers quietly squeaking on the marble floors, sleeves rolled up and hands in pockets. A creak on the floor brought him back as the door opened, and George sat up, unable to help the enormous smile that spread across his face. "Sapnap!" "George!" Sapnap said, dropping his luggage and rushing forward to grip George in a crushing hug. "I missed you!" "Sapnap, thank you so much for letting me stay at your home," George blurted out. "I really mean it. I can't thank you enough." "It's not a problem, man." Sapnap released him, but kept his hands on George's shoulders. His dark eyes were honest. "I told you, you needed a place to stay. Of course I was going to help you out." George crossed his legs under him. "I still don't know how to show you my appreciation." Sapnap raised his hands in a truce. "Just keep the room clean this year, you know? Just keep it clean." "I keep it clean," George protested weakly. "You absolutely do not," Sapnap said. "The room, last year." He stared George directly in the eyes and exaggerated each word. "It was an embarrassment. It was not that bad. The apple juice was growing moldy. You had an apple juice on your desk, and when I opened the lid, it was alive." Sapnap tightened his headband and flicked his hair out of his eyes. "You cannot argue with me." George couldn't argue with him, so he changed the subject. "You're going to get yelled at for your headband." "Maybe I will," Sapnap said. "It's no worse than you getting suspended for wearing that sign that said, what was it again?" He was grinning viciously. George threw his hands up. "That was a peaceful protest. You went to all that effort to replace the seat of Professor Brown's chair with eggs and make it look normal." "Yes, and that was incredibly funny. Didn't you see the look on his face?" George sighed and grinned. "I did. It was funny." "That's correct," Sapnap said. So I think that this year, me wearing a headband against the dress code should probably be the least of your concerns." He glanced at George, lounging with his back against the headboard, and swung his suitcase up onto the bed. "Help me unpack, George." He was a dickhead. Why had George ever decided to room with him again? "Fine. What do you need help with?" They worked to the sounds of the string quartet for a while, Sapnap quietly pointing George to where he wanted everything. Slowly, the room began to fill up with his stuff. "Listen," Sapnap said out of the blue. "Dream's coming over tonight, and we're gonna smoke and hang out, and if you're not too busy doing God knows what, fucking homework or something, I really want you to hang out with us. You have to meet Dream." "Oh, Dream," George said. "I have to meet Dream because who doesn't know Dream? Dream sent me a letter. It's just like the old days. Dream's so amazing. He just went to Alaska. Dream sent me a sculpture of my dick." "Shut up," Sapnap said. "This summer was far out. We went to the Grand Canyon. We went to Yellowstone. We tried to surf. You'll hear about it tonight." "You tried to surf?" George asked. "Did you succeed?" Sapnap threw a pair of boxers at his head, and George shrieked and swatted them away. "Here's the thing," Sapnap said. "I think the two of you are going to get along great. I just, I have to tell you something before you meet him." George looked up at the suddenly hesitant tone of voice. "What?" he asked. Sapnap sighed. He's not going to agree with you about Vietnam." George tensed. Since Sapnap's brother Bad had come home from his tour with an honorable discharge and only one arm, Sapnap had been completely unwilling to talk about Vietnam. He left the classroom if a professor brought it up. He'd asked George not to bring the protests back to their dorm room. He didn't even talk about Bad except to read George parts of his letters. "He's pro-war?" George asked carefully. "His parents, they told him what they wanted to hear for a long time. It's not his fault, and it doesn't make him a bad person. It does make him a bad person," George said. "He's your best friend, and he's still pro-war. Has he even met Bad?" "Don't bring Bad into this," Sapnap snarled. "I'm done talking." George apologized. Sapnap was standing with his back to George, his shoulders slowly moving with his breath. "Sorry, Sapnap." Sapnap sighed and turned back to George, sliding down the bed frame to sit on the floor. "No, it's okay. You gotta understand, Dream was the only person I had for such a long time. We met through a pen pal program when I was like 8 and he was 7. It was this thing through my parents' league society where if you..." He dropped his head back and closed his eyes. "If you were above a certain tax bracket, your kids could write to other kids through this program, so they had friends that were like them." George stared. "Jesus Christ." "I know, okay," Sapnap said. "I know how it sounds, but you know how my parents are. Writing to him when I was young, I mean, it was a best friend handed to me on a silver platter. We had the same interests, we were the same age. When we finally met, it was almost a decade later, and he was still my best friend. And now he's coming to Mulbring, even though his parents wanted him to go to Harvard and Yale, but he's coming here. I know that you guys aren't going to agree on the war, but I really want you to get along. Just try, maybe, for me." He was chewing on his lower lip, and his eyes were wide and honest. George sighed. "I'll give him a chance." "Thank you," Sapnap said. "George, thank you." He stood. "Pick up my boxers, please." "Ew," George said. "You pick them up." 2 hours later, Sapnap's headband was stained through with sweat, but he was unpacked. George took a second to take in the room. It was small to begin with. The beds were pressed against the corners, ceiling slanted over the headboards. A window cut into the wall had enough space on the ledge for George to curl up and read. It was one of the first things he'd noticed when he moved in. 2 desks sat at the base of the beds, and symmetrical closets were built into the walls next to them. George had his books stacked underneath his bed, a row of neat sweater vests and cream button-downs hanging up in his closet, pants stuffed awkwardly in the tiny dresser. Sapnap had already hammered several nails into the walls, uncaring. A row of white headbands and beaded necklaces hung from them. He kept his clothes in boxes under his bed, and his desk was almost empty, unlike George's. Instead of keeping his pants or shirts in his dresser, George had watched him dump all of his socks in a drawer and then bury a baggie of weed and cigarette papers in their midst. "You won't tell, will you, Georgie?" he'd asked. George wanted to smoke that weed more than anything in the entire world, but he wasn't about to admit it. "I won't tell," he said. "Is that what we're going to be smoking tonight?" "Whoa, who's this we?" Sapnap had asked. At the stricken look on George's face, he amended, giggling. "Yes, George, if you want some, you can have some." "I'm going to take a nap," Sapnap said, clambering onto his bed. "Wake me up whenever Dream gets here." "When is Dream supposed to get here?" George asked. "I don't know. Wake me up when it does. Not too hard to understand." George rolled his eyes and sat down at his desk and decided to get the periodicals out of the way. Number 1. President Johnson on Vietnam. This evening I came here to speak to you about Vietnam. Vietnam is the area where communist expansionism is most aggressively at work in the world today, where it is crossing international frontiers in violation of international agreements, where it is killing and kidnapping, where it is ruthlessly attempting to bend free people to its will. Is the aggression a threat to the United States of America and to the peace and security of the entire world in which we in America are a very vital part? George sat in his uncomfortable desk chair, grinding his teeth. It was so obvious what stance his current events professor was going to take on the war in Vietnam, and he was already fed up with it. People could say all they wanted that the U.S. hadn't been interfering for too long a time, but they had. What did they think interfering meant? Killing innocent people? Destroying villages and cities? Guess what? The anger swirled in George's chest, and he leaned over the transcription of the speech again, pencil gripped so tight he thought he might break it. "We are not going to withdraw from that effort. In my opinion, for us to withdraw from that effort would mean a collapse not only of South Vietnam, but Southeast Asia. So we are going to stay there," said President Kennedy. George scribbled in the margins, "Enforce U.S. imperialism / capitalism overseas dash civilian casualties does not equal collapse." He kept reading. "Your American president cannot tell you with certainty that a Southeast Asia dominated by communist power would really bring a third war much closer to terrible reality. I am not prepared to risk the security, indeed the survival of this American nation on mere hope and wishful thinking." "Propaganda," George wrote, and the tip of his pencil broke off. He stuffed the speech back into his folder and shook his head. Maybe he shouldn't have registered for the current events class. There was still time to drop it. He could always replace it with a different political class that would still fit the requirements for his anthropology major. Maybe a class on ancient Greco-Roman politics. Sapnap was majoring in archaeology. Maybe he could offer a couple of ideas. Now that sounded appealing. George made a mental note to look for something. Lyndon Bitch Johnson would have to wait until another day, when George could keep his composure and not want to punch him in his fucking face. He turned to his poetry reading instead. He'd been planning on saving it for later, as a special treat. Maybe at some point when he was alone, when he could put on the Beethoven quartets that Eliot had used as inspiration, really try to empathize with the emotions that he was trying to convey. It had only been a year, and his death still felt raw. T.S. Eliot was the linchpin to George's love of poetry. When he was 14, his mother dragged him to a poetry reading hosted by her women's society. None of the other poetry there had been any good, but at the very end, Eliot had taken the stage. His dry voice was off-putting, his eyes heavy and glasses thick, stage presence negligible. He was there by the sheer grace of God, critically acclaimed at the height of his career, talent, and fame. Essays and books were being written about his poetry, analyzing it, picking it apart word by word. George hadn't known any of that, but he didn't have to. He was drawn in all the same. Time and the bell have buried the day. The black cloud carries the sun away. Will the sunflower turn to us? Will the clematis stray down, bend to us? Tendril and spray, clutch and cling? Chill, fingers of you be curled down to us. After the kingfisher's wing has answered light to light and is silent, the light is still, at the still point of the turning world. His mother had tried to explain the meaning afterwards, something about God. George hadn't been listening to her. He hadn't heard God. He'd heard humanity. By now, he'd already read the four quartets over and over again. His copy was sitting somewhere under his bed, marked up and scribbled in and raged upon. The book sitting on his desk was a different edition, clean and crisp and a little beat up, but unmarked, assigned by his professor. He began to read. George was not one to devour his literature or skim it. He liked to read slowly, carefully, tasting every word as if it was a new dish, a new flavor on his palate. And four quartets was a 10-course meal. It took him half an hour simply to finish carefully, slowly reading the first quartet, and even after that, he had to sit back and take a walk. But to what purpose, disturbing the dust on a bowl of rose leaves? I do not know. He closed the door as quietly as he could on its creaky hinges, trying not to wake Sapnap, and shuffled out. He was still wearing his partially unbuttoned shirt, a little sweaty from helping Sapnap unpack, but it was okay. Most people hadn't moved in yet, and it was already starting to get dark. The students that were already here were probably in the mess hall, getting dinner. At the still point of the turning world, George murmured to himself, opening the door to the lounge at the end of the hallway. The lamps on the wooden tables were all switched off, and George walked to the windows, peering out at the sunset over the Catskills. The latch opened with a quiet creak, and he pushed the window open, breathing the fresh August breeze. Neither flesh nor fleshless, he continued, mostly to himself, partly to see how much he had memorized. Neither from nor towards, at the still point. There the dance is, completed an excited voice behind him, and George whirled, embarrassed. Either the man had snuck in, or George hadn't noticed him. He had long, messy blonde hair, and was wearing grimy gray trousers. A pair of circular gold glasses were perched on his face, and there was what looked to be dried clay smeared on his hair above his ear. He was seated at one of the desks at the far corner of the room, the lamp off, a small book laid out in front of him. "It's Burnt Norton, right?" he asked, his eyes wide. "I recognized it while you were reciting it. I have to read it for a class." "Yeah?" George said. He looked out the window at the sunset, and then back at the man at the desk. "It's one of my favorites." "I don't understand poetry," the man said. "It just doesn't click." "Why are you taking a poetry class, then?" George asked. He closed the window. "So that I can understand poetry," the man said. "Duh." His face creased in a smile. "It's also an English requirement, and I've read enough Wilde to last a lifetime, so poetry it was." "Wilde could last many lifetimes and beyond," George protested. "I never get sick of Dorian Gray." The man shrugged, his eyes narrowing. He leaned back in his chair and examined George. George suddenly felt like a specimen under a microscope, pinned, flayed, exposed. "We all know what happens in the end," the man said. He broke his gaze and looked down at the book in front of him. "Poetry is always a surprise to me, even if I've read it before." "It's really almost the same as reading anything," George said. He sat down at the desk next to the man. He was warm, the heat from his body seeping into George's side. "One thing leads to another. It circles the point it's trying to make and asks you to connect the dots." He held out a hand. "May I?" The man looked startled and then handed over the quartets. His fingertips brushed against George's. "I mean, he tells you right here, right at the beginning," George said. He opened the book up to the first page and pressed his finger to the words. "Here, time present and time past are both perhaps present in time future, and time future contained in time past. And it's like in math, like the commutative property. If all time is eternally present, look, if present in its use in line 2 means that the current moments and the past moments both exist in the future, and the future is in the past as well, then the use of present implies that all time is happening now. It's a double meaning." George paused to take a breath and continued. "All time is unredeemable. Everything that has happened or will happen is set in stone. What about hypotheticals? He sets up the poem for you right there, and then it's your job to relate the rest of the section to what you could consider his thesis statement in the beginning." He leaned in, dragging his finger down the page. "Here is where he dives into the hypothetical, the rose garden, what could have been, and he acknowledges the uselessness of it. But Eliot, he was very religious, so you have to look beyond the analogies in the poem and—" George cut himself off and stared hard at the page. He removed his hand from the book and adjusted the collar of his shirt. He looked up. The man's lips were curled into a smile. "Are you done?" he asked. "I'm done," George said. This close to him, his bright eyes held a glint that George would have recognized anywhere. "Don't tell me that wasn't informative." "It wasn't informative," the man said. "You asked for help." "I never asked for help." "You said that you didn't understand poetry. That's you, indirectly, asking for help." "Sounds to me like I was just trying to make conversation." He leaned sideways in his chair, his arm draped over the back, his legs spread wide. His head was tilted to the side, collarbone exposed above his t-shirt. George let his eyes drag over him. "What kind of conversation were you trying to make, then?" The man shrugged with one shoulder. He sucked his bottom lip between his teeth and released it, swollen and wet. "Whatever worked." George inhaled slowly. They were still in the clear. He could choose to move forward with this or let it simmer down and die. The moment stretched and he leaned forward. "Do you really think it's that easy?" The man's eyes narrowed and his smile stretched. "What would make it easier?" "You could give me a name," George said, tilting his head. "Give you a name," the man said. "I think I'll call you Sam." It was cheesy and dumb, but it was surprising and made him laugh. The hiccuping little laugh that he hated. But the man sitting in front of him looked so pleased about it that George couldn't bring himself to care. "What a bad joke," he said, and the man's face turned dumbfounded. "What are you talking about?" he said dryly, a tinge of unhappiness coloring his cheeks. "That's your name now, unless you'd prefer a different one." "Steve." "That's worse." "Alexander." "Not Alex." "Full name, Alexander, the Emperor, the Great." "I'm more like a Hephaestion," George said without thinking. This time it was the man's turn to laugh, his voice tilting up at the end, eyes crinkling behind his glasses. "Okay, Hephaestion." "Now you know my name," George said, teasing. "What's yours?" The man leaned forward, his lips parted. Alexander. The door behind them opened, and George jerked away. What were they doing? What were they doing? And in a public place? At the still point of the turning world, he blurted out, pointing desperately to four quartets. Neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards. At the still point, there the dance is, Alexander said, his voice low, as the boy who had just entered slammed his bag into a chair and sat with a heavy sigh. George was hyper-aware of the space between him and Alexander. The vacuum that their sudden separation had created. He realized suddenly that the book wasn't open. But neither rest nor movement, he murmured, flushed and embarrassed and cold, Alexander's heat no longer pressing into him. He stood, taking the four quartets. I'll see you round, Alexander. Alexander's eyes tracked him as he stood, flicking down to the table again, his voice thick. Yeah. See you round, Hephaestion.